We left off last time talking about everyday enlightenment, those moments of truth that are possible for us when we awaken into the present, when we pay deep attention to our inner experience and step beyond the confines of the small self. Touching truth brings balance and well-being. And we realize that, as my own teacher is always saying, happiness is the foundation of a spiritual life. Happiness is the foundation of a spiritual life. Not suffering, not redemption, not struggle, but happiness. The problem is that our definition of what happiness can mean is too narrow. We tend to think of happiness as a conditional thing, a kind of a brass ring to be grabbed or some ideal state to be achieved. We imagine that happiness is a consequence of the positive things that happen to us and is dependent on outside circumstances. This materialistic view of happiness as a commodity is especially attractive to a secular culture such as ours that's based on acquisition and comparison. We tend to judge and compare our happiness levels. We don't want our happiness to be bruised or broken. It's a precious but perishable thing in our view. It's ephemeral and vulnerable to the winds of change. But what if that view of happiness is actually wrong? What if happiness is much simpler than that? What if it's not a thing to be added or achieved or clung to, but instead an awareness to be revealed that is always already within us? What if happiness is closer to equilibrium than giddiness? What if it's less an intoxication than a kind of sober connection to the totality of our experience, leaving nothing out? How might our lives improve if we could redefine happiness not as a high that comes and goes when we get what we want, but as a steady, humble, imperfect gladness? This kind of happiness or gladness would enable us to accept the present moment with gratitude and recognize the wonder and marvelousness of our lives regardless of the changes that may be coming. This would give us the freedom to surrender to the conditions of our lives and bless those conditions. Such an unconditional happiness isn't the same as being in a good mood. It's not just feeling terrific when things go our way. It's much more durable than that. It's an approach to happiness that appreciates the complexities and hardship of life and doesn't seek to hide them under some smiley face cartoon version of well-being. I spoke to Matthew Fox a few years back, and he was talking to me about the absence of wonder and awe in contemporary life, and he was connecting the absence of wonder and awe to depression, the epidemic of depression in our culture. And he said something to me I've never forgotten. He said, "We live in a beautiful world, not a pretty one." We live in a beautiful world, not a pretty one. And this is so important. As inhabitants of this complex, beautiful world, we're invited to live happy lives, but not flawless ones. Just as love is tested when the going gets rough and only intensifies as we learn to abide and bend with our changes and allow our hearts to be deepened by experience, so happiness can intensify in difficult times when we remember the beauty of the world and stop resenting the fact that it's not always pretty. Let me tell you about a student of mine who came to work with me in self-inquiry. I'll call her Leslie. Leslie was a 48-year-old attorney and an activist who'd been married to her female partner for several decades when she was diagnosed with a serious gynecological cancer that left her something like a 50-50 chance of survival. Now, as a type A go-getter kind of person, Leslie attacked her own healing the way she charged at all the other obstacles put in her way, especially as a gay woman of a certain age who remembered how life had been pre-liberation, and when she'd fought long and hard for women's rights and developed a kind of armor of optimism that carried her through many painful setbacks. At first, Leslie's strategy worked. It carried her through a successful surgery, a radiation treatment. She was the model patient, gung-ho, ultra-positive, jumping through every hoop that her oncologist, her group leader, her therapist, and the army of healers held up for her. She just kept going. But as the months passed and chemo began, once the initial flush of the challenge had passed, and Leslie found herself too sick to go to the bathroom by herself, she was painfully aware that what she took to be her life, this persona on which she constructed her identity, was truly beginning to fall apart and leave her with no solid ground to hold on to. She was wondering who Leslie was. Who is this Leslie person without her bounce and her determination? What was her life worth in this diminished state? For the first time, confronted by physical limitation, Leslie began to feel powerless, and this buoyant dynamism that she was known for became a distant memory for her, and that left her in a very deep depression. Looking back on her past, she was now questioning who that happy person had been, who was so sure of herself and so full of hope. When Leslie came to me wanting to work through this depression, through writing and through self-inquiry, these were the questions that were troubling her. Had that happy person been lost forever? Was this bald, grim-looking woman that she saw in the mirror her new true self? And if so, how could she live this way if she wanted to live at all? Leslie found herself, as so many of us have in hard times, quite at the end of her rope. She was no longer connected to her old life, but she wasn't yet attuned to a new way of being either. So I began by asking Leslie to write about what had not been lost in her illness. What had her cancer not taken away? She'd been so obsessed by what was missing, the things that prevented her from being, quote-unquote, herself, that the first important step was to question the stories she was telling herself. Was it true that she was no longer the person she was? What did it mean to no longer be herself? What did that self that she believed she was require in order to exist? What were its prerequisites, those things without which she no longer felt like Leslie? Well, at first she struggled with the question, which she said she found kind of academic and futile. She wrote to me, she said, "Isn't it obvious what's missing?" Intellectually, Leslie was perfectly aware that what made her herself wasn't her hair or her achievements or her job or even her health. So what were the things that she was missing so powerfully that seemed to be separating her from her former self? Well, the more Leslie investigated this question, the more she became aware that the essential lost piece that she was missing was the outlook on life that had defined her. It wasn't what she did, it was her outlook on life that had defined her, what she called, quote, my shiny way of seeing things, unquote. That optimism that had always carried her through as if she were, quote unquote, invulnerable. Now, when Leslie showed me what she'd written, that was the word that leapt out at me, invulnerable. So I suggested that she dig a bit deeper into what invulnerability meant to her. And this is what she wrote, quote, it's not that I'm literally invulnerable, more like circumstances can never destroy me, that I can stand up to whatever hits me. I don't feel that way anymore. I now know that I can be destroyed, unquote. So I threw that back at her. Was that true? Was it true that she had been destroyed? Have you actually been destroyed? Or has your idea of yourself been destroyed? What if, rather than destroying her, I said to Leslie, her illness was actually revealing her in ways that she had never known before? What if it was showing depths of authenticity and courage that she didn't even know she possessed? While acknowledging that those qualities might not seem cheerful or uplifting or positive in the way that she was used to being, what might some of these qualities be that were still with her, or that cancer had allowed to surface? When Leslie wrote back to me, her tone had changed. It was tentative still, but it was a bit more open. And this is what she wrote, quote, I've noticed something calm in myself, a kind of quietness I never slowed down enough to notice before. I think I may be stronger in some ways than I thought, but they're not exactly strengths I ever focused on. I can tolerate a lot of pain. I found that I can be still in a way I could never do before. I used to have to be busy all the time. Now I can stare out my window at a tree for an hour and feel fairly peaceful. There was a time in my life that I couldn't stop talking. Now I can spend an entire day silent and actually kind of enjoy it. It's not exactly fun, she said in all caps, or something that I'd recommend to others, but there are moments when I feel kind of, what's the word, transparent, like there's less ego. I can't show off, I can't wave my achievements around like a flag, but I can kind of just be, capital B, capital E, and that can be weirdly satisfying, unquote. So Leslie had really touched on the heart of the matter, the difference between natural well-being and the happiness that requires outward results to make it real. The qualities that she was describing were tied to being rather than to doing, to presence more than performance, to equanimity more than her usual role as an inspirational cheerleader for other people. Although these qualities were unfamiliar to Leslie, and they certainly didn't match her idea of happiness, these quieter, less egotistical virtues had genuine value, and she had to admit that. They were liberating as well. Sometimes on a good day, Leslie wrote that she could almost enjoy this new perspective. As we worked together, she came to see that the self she imagined she'd lost in her illness was actually quite intact. And that when she stepped away from how things had been, her pictures of what happiness was supposed to look like, her presence was still there without any doubt. In fact, this presence was stronger than ever. And she came to understand that her practice now was to learn to value this presence as much as she prized the golden ring of so-called happiness. This essential self, this essential well-being couldn't be taken away. She could ignore it, as many of us do in the throes of our material lives, or she could take it for granted. Or Leslie could put this presence to its greatest use by recognizing that it is the source of her well-being and that its cultivation is a reason for living. Okay, the cultivation of presence, the cultivation of well-being, the cultivation of gladness are reasons for being in themselves. And when she started to think about it, she saw it could open up a whole new realm of happiness that she'd been unfamiliar with, as most of us are, till we're forced to this kind of a reckoning. Now, in speaking about reckoning, which we're all forced to by aging, I was thinking about James Hillman, the great Jungian psychologist, once said to me that as people age, they enter a whole new kind of adventure, which he called the adventure of slowness. I like that. The adventure of slowness. Hillman used to talk about how getting in and out of the bathtub was tantamount to climbing a mountain. It required that much attentiveness and effort, and it also delivered a new kind of satisfaction. That reminded me of what a man who was recovering from a long illness wrote about, or actually said to someone in an interview, about an epiphany that he had in his sickbed. He had nothing to do but stare out the window for hours. But rather than being a waste of time, this forced convalescence actually revealed things that he had never seen before. Let me read you what he wrote, or what he said, quote, "I had never in my life seen an icicle formed from beginning to end, but the hours of doing nothing which cancer provided allowed me to look outside my window in awe of slowly dripping water that turned into a long, sharp, invincible-looking icicle that slowly melted away right before my eyes in the morning sun and mysteriously returned again in the late evening. I saw colors in that icicle that I had never seen before or had failed to realize what I had seen." Unquote. And that's the point. That when we stop, or we're forced to stop, and we put down our toys and our distractions, and we pay attention to the wonder of the world, happiness arises in us naturally. It arises unconditionally, as a consequence of being in this attentive and curious way. As Leslie discovered when her story of what happiness could mean was challenged, she realized that even in the midst of depression, she was aware of those moments when her mind stopped struggling and comparing herself to her own past self, and she could feel a kind of peace. It wasn't a rah-rah exuberance or exhilaration. It was more like a quiet knowing. It was an experience itself that was sufficient just as it was. And she was grateful for it. She was becoming grateful for it in spite of her limitations. And this is the knowing that's available to all of us when we begin to expand our definition of what happiness might include. So ask yourself, where do you draw the line on happiness? Can you be happy when the going gets rough? Can you be happy when your sense of self is challenged, when you don't get what you want? Can you be happy regardless of what happens to you? Simply by tuning into the presence that lives in you without any fanfare. Are you even aware of that presence? This is a very important question for all of us, because most of the time we're not. Now, let's talk about the psychology of happiness a little bit. We've touched on the spiritual dimension of happiness. We know, for example, that happiness is a malleable, improvable thing. That's the big aha that comes out of positive psychology and neuroscience, the awareness of neuroplasticity, the fact that the brain can be changed and improved, and that happiness also is a malleable, improvable thing. Now, we're talking about the feeling of happiness here, okay? We've changed levels. We were speaking about a spiritual gladness that's bigger than this. Now we're just talking about what we know about the psychology of happiness because it's so interesting. And it actually does have parallels, echoes in what we know about the spiritual qualities of gladness. We know that each of us is born with a level of subjective well-being, it's called. It's also known as the set point of happiness. It's a kind of genetic level from giddy to grumpy. And that set point, that SWB, that set point of happiness, is where your happiness levels tend to settle regardless of circumstances. There's a famous study of identical twins who were reared in different environments that showed that the set point determines about 50% of our predisposition to happiness. But subjectivity is even more important than genetics. Homeless people in Calcutta, for example, have been found to be less unhappy than those living in California because they have a stronger sense of community. As one researcher put it, quote, if you really want to be happier than your grandparents provided for in your genes, you have to learn the kind of things you can do day by day to bounce your set point up and avoid the things that bounce it down. There are many SWB raising tools, as many as there are people in need of a lift. It appears that, let me just talk about a few of the things that are known. It appears that using a number of tools at once is most effective. Positive psychologists make suggestions that range from commonsensical, like getting sufficient sleep and exercise, nurturing close relationships, maintaining an optimistic but realistic outlook, using your best skills in work and play, to attitude shifts and inner work that might not immediately spring to mind when thinking about the tools for happiness. For example, one very high priority for people in terms of their well-being is taking control of their own time. It's a very, very high priority. So ask yourself, how do you feel in relation to time? Do you feel that you are the master of your own time? Okay. Or do you feel that time is stolen from you? Do you feel that time is constantly slipping away? Okay. Look at your relationship to time. That has a lot to do with well-being. Another thing that is helpful, apparently, is acting happy, because there's a link between facial expression and emotion that we now understand. So we can actually rewire our brains by learning to smile more. We actually feel better when we smile more. So it's counterintuitive, but that apparently is how it works. Okay. Happy people tend to rely on shortcuts, familiar shortcuts, meaning psychological shortcuts, instead of overthinking every situation. Okay, overthinking, perseverating is a fast way to feel worse. On average, according to a survey that was done by the National Opinion Research Center, the more friends you have, the happier you are. So the more connections you have, intimate connections, caring connections, the happier you are. And the practice of forgiveness, finally, is a trait that's strongly linked to happiness. They suggest that a daily moment of forgiveness might well be one very useful and powerful way to raise your subjective well-being. So the most exciting news, of course, is that mental practices like meditation can promote subjective well-being. I call it the most exciting news because it's a practice you can do regularly, where you can see quantifiable results. At the University of Wisconsin, Richie Davidson, who's a professor of psychology and psychiatry, found that high levels of activity at the left frontal area of the cerebral cortex coincided with feelings of happiness, enthusiasm, joy, high energy, and alertness, whereas activity on the right frontal area corresponded to feelings of sadness, anxiety, and worry. Meditation appears to be one way of redistributing this balance and sparking more left brain activity and thus positive emotion. Jon Kabat-Zinn put it this way. He says, quote, "We have a sort of autoimmune disease, chronic stress and discontent, caused by not looking deeply enough into this question of genuine happiness." Let me just repeat that. We have a sort of autoimmune disease, chronic stress and discontent, that's caused by not looking deeply enough into this question of genuine happiness, which Jon Kabat-Zinn attributes to mindfulness. He says, it's possible even in the midst of hardship to experience simple pleasures, to know delight what's right and beautiful with the world. Isn't that nice? To know delight and what's right and beautiful with the world. He says, with mental balance, we develop a keel-like ballast that helps us to remain stable even under extreme conditions. So there's that word again, balance. Balance. Balance is what psychologists and spiritual teachers agree is central to what we think of as well-being. So ask yourself, where is your own life off balance? Where do you feel out of control or at the effect of circumstances, or unable to find your own center, your own keel? And what would it take for you to center yourself? What practice or shift to habits or attitudes or addictions? What would it take to be balanced in your own life? These are really critical questions to ask ourselves on the path. If we hope to lead happier lives that don't depend on quite so much outward good luck. This was talking about inner good luck, inner happiness that we can generate from within. This is a quality that you see very vividly in third world countries like India. I've spent a lot of time in India, and you often meet people in the gravest squalor who positively radiate kindness and balance. When I was in Varanasi, there was a beggar who was always outside my little hostel. He had no legs. He had one arm, no legs. He would sit on this blanket. And everyone who passed this man, he blessed. He sort of glowed with gratitude when somebody dropped a rupee into his cup. It was amazing. You always felt better after you walked past this man. And I asked myself, what does this homeless man know that a lot of us in much more comfortable circumstances, up to our ears in therapy bills, don't know? What does he know? What do these people know? How is it possible to thrive despite outward poverty or loss? These are very important questions for all of us to ponder. So let's just stay on the psychological, scientific level for a moment. Regardless of the particular tools that we choose to help lift our own set point, one thing is very certain, and that's that we are better off aiming for happiness moment to moment than trying to engineer happiness through long-term planning. And that's because, as we now know from science, human beings are pretty hopeless at predicting what will make us happy or how long that happiness is going to last. Dan Gilbert at Harvard spends his life exploring this riddle of self-delusion. He's a pioneer in the field that's known as affective forecasting, where researchers measure the gap between what we believe will make us happy and how wrong we tend to be. Dan Gilbert said to me, quote, "We're such strangers to ourselves, nowhere more than in our pursuit of the holy grail of happiness. We usually overestimate how things will affect us and rarely underestimate them." This discrepancy, which is known as impact bias, causes a great deal of what Dan Gilbert calls miswanting. For example, we scrimp and we save for the bigger house, only to find ourselves more isolated than ever from our neighbors, or too exhausted from the overwork to enjoy the swimming pool. So we get our values mixed up. We project ourselves into the idea of having this beautiful pool, and it's going to make us so happy. And by the time it's dug and ready to go, we're working so hard that we don't end up using it, for example. Also, the results of our choices aren't nearly as life-changing as we think that they're going to be. There's a famous study that was done in 1978 among lottery winners and paraplegics, and they found that both groups adjusted to their respective circumstances with surprising results. The lottery winners settled back to the levels of happiness that didn't differ significantly from where they had been before, and the paraplegics, while they were less happy, were not as unhappy as they expected. In fact, one study revealed that major events, happy or not, tend to lose their impact on happiness levels in less than 3 months. And if we understood how quickly this normalizing process works, we might invest our hopes in things that could actually help us feel better long term. Experts agree that a lifetime of chasing money, of course, rarely raises subjective well-being. Once middle-class comforts are in place, happiness doesn't increase. As Dan Gilbert puts it, the first 40 grand makes a dramatic difference, but after basic needs are met, the next 10 million does almost nothing. We can't hang on to this idea, this delusion that getting more stuff is going to make us happier. Marty Seligman, who is the godfather of the positive psychology movement, has created a 3-zone model of happiness. The first tier is what he calls the Hollywood view of happiness, getting as much positive emotion as possible. The second tier of happiness comes from discovering what he calls our signature strengths, which are important to look at. So if you don't know Seligman's work, check it out. These signature strengths are very revealing and might help you connect in ways where you might not feel satisfied or effective or passionate in your own work or how you relate to the world. Some of these signature strengths are honesty, kindness, forgiveness, ingenuity, love of learning. And the third zone of happiness, according to Marty Seligman, is using your strengths in the service of something larger than yourself. Something larger than yourself. It seems that transcending our own needs, learning to sacrifice what we want for the greater good, often boosts our happiness levels in ways that we don't expect. But, and this is very important, volunteering each and every week at your local soup kitchen isn't going to do you a lot of good if you haven't taken care of your personal issues. I'm down here in Costa Rica right now teaching with Roshi Joan Halifax, a Zen teacher, who's just written a wonderful book about what she calls edge states. It's called, let me get the title for you right here. It's a wonderful book. This book is called Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet. And I highly recommend this book. I'll send out a reminder to the group. It's a beautiful group. But the point that she makes is that alongside our edge states, which tend to be positive, there are shadows. And one edge state is what she calls altruism. And the other side of altruism is pathological altruism that leads to burnout. So intention is everything when it comes to helping other people. So ask yourself, in your own do-gooderness or your own approach to helping? Do you neglect yourself? Do you take care of your own needs as well? Or do you believe that sacrificing your needs for the other is some kind of a spiritual boon? Because that's a very common misconception, and it's one that turns a lot of people off to doing service work. As they say, "Why am I so burned out?" And often it's because they're not taking care of themselves. They're not realizing charity starts at home, and that self-care is not the same as egotism or self-centeredness. Self-care is a function of love. And finally, there is an undeniable link, apparently, between subjective well-being and how we perceive ourselves in relation to the norm. Remember, we were talking about comparison. Feeling that we fall short or that we possess less than people around us invites a sense of discontent. And with workaholism at an all-time peak these days, the competitive spirit often spirals out of control. Economists call this fruitless work, work that's more than necessary to do the job, and say that fruitless work is a source of what they call social pollution. Social pollution, a contagion of envy and striving that keeps us consuming without feeling better, as Dan Gilbert puts it. So let's just recap. This is a lot. First of all, happiness is not a commodity. Okay? Happiness is a state of being it's a state of being that's related to balance that enables us to remain spacious and accepting and present regardless of what happens to us. It's a state that's undergirded by gladness. A gladness that leads to gratitude for the opportunity to have this human experience at all. This isn't a kind of a maudlin Pollyanna gratitude. This is a tough gratitude. Because it's a fierce gratitude. There's a great line in a poem by Jack Gilbert that speaks to this kind of happiness we're talking about today. He says, "We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world." How great is that? We must have the stubbornness to accept our gladness in the ruthless furnace of this world. How gorgeous. It's true that we do need stubbornness to safeguard our own happiness against the constant demands and constraints of the world. It takes a lot of stubbornness. It takes courage, too, to be ourselves in a world that demands conformity on more levels than we're even aware. But our happiness does depend on that decision to be true to ourselves, to know ourselves, and to recognize that knowing ourselves is always a choice. It's always a choice. That's what we're doing in the Seeker's Forum. We're choosing to show up for ourselves, to ask questions that we don't ask in the general run of our lives. So happiness itself is a choice. Happiness is a choice. Let me just give you in closing 6 simple practices for choosing your own happiness. Number 1, simplify your life, learn to be quiet, and become aware of presence. Okay? Simplify your life, learn to be quiet, and become aware of presence. So tuning in. Number 2, notice how it feels to do nothing. How comfortable are you doing nothing? This is fantastic practice. Anyone who meditates is more than familiar with this. Anyone who writes is more than familiar with this. Not that you're doing nothing, but you do, in isolation, you notice that the demons come out. Meditation is closer to doing nothing than writing, but many of the same demons come to visit. So notice how it feels to stop. Number 3, practice sufficiency. Sufficiency. A sense of being enough. We were talking last time about sukha, which is that quality of spiritual energy. And one of the qualities of sukha is repleteness, fullness. So practice that sense of sufficiency, unconditional sufficiency. How does that feel? Is that possible for you? Number 4, distinguish between pleasure and joy and make your choices accordingly. This is an important one. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. I'm as hedonistic as anyone else. But it's important to know the difference between pleasure and joy. and to understand what choices we're making when and why. That's all. That's all. So there's lighthearted fun, superficial pleasures, fantastic. A part of life, beautiful. But they don't lead to joy. And if one thinks that they do, one is in big trouble. As anyone knows who's ever had a hangover. Number 5, identify where you are greedy, envious, and competitive. Now, we all are. I mean, there's an element of greed and envy and competition in all of us. And particularly when we're speaking about happiness being a commodity, that's deeply connected to greed in us. Wanting more happiness, wanting a better happiness, wanting happiness that's more like the Joneses, okay, a bigger happiness. Greed, envy, competition is a little triumvirate of misery. So ask yourself, where does greed trouble you? And where does greed interfere with your ability to be happy? Same with envy. Where does envy stop you from loving what you are and what you do have, and blessing the other? And finally, where does competition blind you? It's so easy to get sucked into competition and forget who we are and what we're doing and why we're doing it. And finally, number 6, cultivate the awareness that all of experience is hyphenate. Hyphenate. So there's ugly, beautiful, sad, pretty, strong, weak, courageous, afraid. All emotions are hyphenate. And when we get that, we understand that happiness, even though it's balanced, it has balance in it, it's also allowed to be messy. Happiness can be messy. So you can be happy sad, you can be happy jealous, you can be happy tired, you can be happy many other things. Because if we can't be happy in the midst of our messy lives, where do we expect to be happy? That's really the question. So ask yourself, where does the mess of your life, or what appears to be the mess of your life, interfere with your own well-being? Where do you confuse yourself with your circumstances? And how can you cultivate this presence, this sense of the deep source of being in yourself, that it doesn't change with situations, that truly is invulnerable? What can you do to cultivate that awareness? Because that's the source of joy. And that's what we're doing, all of us on any kind of a spiritual path, is moving toward happiness, moving toward our own joy.